She negotiated with the governor of a colonial empire face to face, using her own attendant as a human throne. She built an army out of escaped enslaved people and conquered 2 kingdoms. She fought Portugal for 40 years. She was still commanding military campaigns in her 70s. Most people today have never heard her name. Meet Nzinga of Ndongo. Born around 1583 in the Kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now northern Angola, Nzinga entered the world already fighting. The umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck at birth. Her people took it as a sign. A difficult birth meant a powerful soul. A complicated arrival meant something great was coming. They were not wrong. Her father was the king, and even though she was not the heir, that distinction belonged to her brother, Mbandi. Her father treated her differently from the other children. He brought her into war councils and legal councils. He trained her alongside his warriors. She learned to fight with a battle axe. She learned to read and write in Portuguese from the missionaries who visited their court. She absorbed everything: military strategy, statecraft, diplomacy, the art of watching powerful men and knowing exactly what they wanted. She was not supposed to rule. Her father trained her as if she was. But the world around her was already collapsing. Portugal had arrived in Ndongo's territory in 1575. Within a generation, they had built forts inside Ndongan land to control the slave trade, burned villages, and seized hostages by the tens of thousands. By some accounts, 50,000 people were enslaved from the region during this period. The kingdom fractured from the pressure. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to the crown began defecting to the Portuguese. The king, her father, tried everything: negotiation, open warfare, alliances. Nothing worked. Ndongo was being swallowed alive, and no one could stop it. Then her father died. Her brother Mbandi took the throne in 1617. And the first thing he did was come for her. Mbandi eliminated every rival he could reach. Half-brothers, cousins, anyone with a claim to power, gone. Then he turned to Nzinga. He had her young son killed. He ordered that Nzinga and both of her sisters be forcibly sterilized, so she could never produce another heir, never become a mother again, never build a bloodline that could one day challenge his. She was 35 years old, and her own brother had just tried to surgically remove her future. But Mbandi was not his father. He had no military skill and no diplomatic instinct. The Portuguese were pushing deeper into Ndongan territory. The Mbangala, brutal nomadic warrior bands the Portuguese had been hiring as mercenaries, were cutting through everything in their path. The kingdom was close to total collapse. In 1621, after years of trying to neutralize her, Mbandi turned to Nzinga in desperation. He needed an ambassador, someone who spoke Portuguese, someone with royal standing and enough intelligence to walk into a colonial government and not flinch. He needed her. She agreed, but not without conditions. She would go as his representative with full authority to negotiate in his name, not as a servant, not as a figurehead, as the voice of Ndongo itself. He had no choice but to accept. She arrived in Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital, with her full royal retinue. She wore traditional Ndongan clothing, feathers, jewels, every element of her culture on full display. A deliberate choice. She was not arriving as a conquered person. She would not perform submission for their benefit. When she entered the meeting room to face Portuguese Governor João Correia de Sousa, here is what she found: chairs for the Portuguese officials and a mat on the floor for her. This was not an accident. This was policy. Conquered Africans sat lower. Conquered Africans did not meet colonial eyes at an equal level. Here's the twist. Nzinga looked at the mat. She looked at her attendant. She made a decision in an instant. Her attendant knelt on the floor, and Nzinga sat, composedly, calmly, on her attendant's back. Elevated, eye to eye with the governor. Then she negotiated. She secured the release of Ndongan hostages. She won a Portuguese commitment to withdraw forces from Ndongan territory. She agreed to open Ndongo's borders to missionaries, and she was baptized as a Christian, not out of faith, but as a calculated diplomatic maneuver. A Christian name gave her standing in European courts. She took the name Ana de Sousa, borrowing the governor's own surname as her own. The woman they tried to seat on the floor left with a treaty. But the peace did not hold. It rarely did. By 1624, Mbandi was dead. The circumstances are disputed. Possibly suicide, possibly not. And Nzinga stepped forward to claim power. The nobles objected immediately. By tradition, a woman could not rule Ndongo. Her legitimacy was challenged from the start. While she was managing the internal opposition, the Portuguese made their move. In 1626, they declared war on Ndongo, recognized a rival king, a man named Angola, as the legitimate ruler, and launched a military campaign to install him by force. Within 2 years, Nzinga's army was depleted, and she was driven into exile. Most people, at 45 years old, pushed out of their own kingdom after everything she had already survived, would have stopped. That's it. The story ends there with a footnote and a half. Nzinga was not finished. Not even close. In exile, she did not collapse. She built. She forged an alliance, sealed through marriage, with the Imbangala, the same mercenary forces Portugal had been using as a weapon against Ndongo. She flipped the weapon. Using her new military backing, she moved south and east into the neighboring Kingdom of Matamba. Between 1631 and 1635, she conquered it entirely. Matamba had a tradition of female rulers. Resistance was limited. And suddenly, the woman who had been pushed out of her own kingdom had a new one. Farther from Portuguese interference, harder to reach, easier to defend. From Matamba, she rebuilt from scratch. Displaced Ndongan nobles came to her. So did people who had escaped Portuguese slave raids. She gave them land. She gave them titles. She gave them something to fight for. She assembled a fighting force out of the dispossessed and the discarded, and she used it to disrupt Portuguese slave trade routes wherever her reach extended. She was building a rival power in the middle of a colonial war zone. Then, in 1641, the opening she had been waiting years to walk through finally appeared. The Dutch West India Company seized Luanda from the Portuguese. Overnight, the colonial architecture of Central Africa shifted. Nzinga moved immediately. She entered into a formal alliance with the Dutch and launched a coordinated campaign to reclaim Ndongo. Between 1641 and 1644, she won. She and her Dutch allies defeated the Portuguese in multiple engagements and reclaimed large portions of Ndongan territory. She was in her late 50s. She was still commanding armies. She was still winning. But no alliance holds forever. In 1648, a Portuguese fleet retook Luanda. The Dutch withdrew from Angola entirely. Nzinga was back to fighting alone, from a kingdom she had built herself, against an empire that had spent 20 years trying to outlast her. She continued anyway. It took until 1656, 30 years after she had first been driven into exile, for both sides to finally reach a peace agreement. Portugal acknowledged her sovereignty over Matamba. The colonial power that had spent 3 decades trying to erase her sat down across from her and accepted terms. She was 73 years old when she signed it. In the years that followed, she kept governing. She worked to secure the return of enslaved Ndongan people. She used her renewed ties with the Catholic Church as a diplomatic instrument, as she always had. She shaped the political future of the kingdom she had built out of nothing. She died on December 17, 1663, at approximately 80 years old. 4 decades of rule. 2 kingdoms governed. 1 colonial empire that never managed to break her. Her reward? The Western world largely forgot she existed. For centuries, she appeared in European accounts of the Atlantic slave trade as an anecdote, the queen who sat on a servant, as if one clever gesture was the entirety of what she was. Not the military strategist who conquered a kingdom in exile. Not the diplomat who negotiated a peace treaty with an empire at 73. Not the woman who built an army out of the people that empire had tried to enslave and erase. Just a curiosity, a footnote. That's it. Today, Nzinga stands in bronze in the Kinexixi Square in Luanda. Her face is on Angolan currency. She has inspired operas, novels, and national holidays. Angola has not forgotten her. The rest of the world is still catching up. She was forgotten. Not anymore. Follow for a new forgotten woman every single day.